The silence of the afternoon was shattered by the grinding of wheels against asphalt. Elena watched as a gleaming white SUV pulled up, its polished exterior reflecting the harsh midday sun. She recognized the driver immediately, Margaret Whitmore, the most vocal member of the Maple Grove EHOO Compliance Committee. Margaret stepped out, clipboard in hand, her designer sunglasses perched like a weapon of suburban warfare. Elena's heart raced, but she stood her ground on the front porch, arms crossed, a silent sentinel protecting her home and her art. "Mrs. Martinez," Margaret began, her voice dripping with forced politeness, "we're here to discuss the unauthorized modifications to your property." She emphasized unauthorized, as if the word itself could demolish Elena's resolve. Behind Margaret, two additional committee members emerged, a middle-aged man with a laser measure and a woman clutching a thick binder of HOA regulations like a sacred text. They moved with the calculated precision of a military inspection team, their eyes scanning every inch of Elena's meticulously maintained yard. Elena knew the backstory of her mural. Each brushstroke was a memory, a connection to her grandmother Maria, a renowned artist who had survived political upheaval in Mexico, who had taught Elena that art was more than decoration, it was resistance. The mural wasn't just paint on a fence, it was a narrative of survival, of cultural pride, of family history. The native plants surrounding the fence told their own story. Mexican sunflowers with their brilliant orange petals, milkweed that attracted monarch butterflies, native grasses that danced in the wind. Each plant was a deliberate choice. They were a rebellion against the sterile, chemical-laden lawns that dominated Maple Grove. "The fence exceeds the approved height by 2 inches," the man with the laser measure declared, his voice monotone and mechanical. "And the mural violates Section 4, Paragraph 3 of the Neighborhood Aesthetic Guidelines." Elena met Margaret's gaze, her eyes burning with quiet defiance. "This fence has been here for 15 years, she responded, her English precise and controlled. "And the mural is a tribute to my family's history." Margaret's lips tightened. "Personal history is not an exception to community standards, Mrs. Martinez. Uniformity ensures property values. Diversity creates." "Chaos?" Elena interrupted, her voice sharp. "Or beauty?" The confrontation hung in the air, thick with unspoken tensions. This was more than a dispute about a fence or a mural. This was a battle about belonging, about the right to exist authentically in a space that seemed designed to erase individuality. Frank, her elderly neighbor, appeared at the fence line. His presence was a silent statement of solidarity. A veteran of civil rights movements, he understood the deeper implications of this moment. "Sometimes," Frank called out, loud enough for Margaret and her compliance team to hear, "the most American thing you can do is challenge a rule that doesn't make sense." Margaret's composure cracked for just a moment. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, quickly masked by professional rigidity. The compliance team shifted uncomfortably, sensing they were part of something larger than a simple property violation. Elena knew the real battle was just beginning. This was about more than a mural. This was about the soul of a community, about who gets to define belonging, about the thin line between order and oppression. The SUV remained, a white monument to bureaucratic determination, but Elena Martinez was not backing down. The community center's fluorescent lights cast a harsh, unforgiving glow on the assembled homeowners. Elena sat near the back, her fingers tracing the edges of the manila folder containing her research. Around her, a mosaic of frustration and resignation painted the faces of her neighbors. To her left, Mrs. Chen clutched a photograph of her traditional wind chimes, delicate brass instruments that had hung in her family for generations. Behind her, the Rodriguez family huddled together, their teenage son's basketball hoop, a symbol of childhood joy, now reduced to a point of contention. Robert Thornton called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. The sound echoed through the room like a declaration of war. "We will now address several property violations," he announced, his voice a blend of bureaucratic monotone and barely concealed superiority. "Maple Grove Estates maintains the highest standards of community living, and these standards must be upheld." Elena caught Frank's eye. The retired civil rights attorney gave her an almost imperceptible nod. Years of legal battle had taught him that true change rarely came from playing by the established rules. As Thornton began listing violations, a pattern emerged. The targets were predominantly families of color, recent immigrants, those who dared to express individuality. A basketball hoop here, a cultural decoration there, native plants instead of perfect green lawns. Each violation was a thinly veiled attempt to enforce a narrow definition of acceptable living. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke first, her voice trembling but determined. "My son has nowhere to play. The community park is always full, and this hoop, it's his only place to practice." Thornton's response was swift and clinical. Recreation equipment must be stored out of public view. Section 7, paragraph 2 is clear. Alina's turn came next. She approached the podium, her presentation carefully prepared. Years of professional experience as a graphic designer had taught her the power of visual communication. Her board displayed not just her mural, but a comprehensive analysis. Historical photographs showed the diverse architectural styles that once made neighborhoods vibrant. Research demonstrated how native landscaping supported local ecosystems. Personal stories illustrated the cultural significance of outdoor spaces. "This isn't about a fence," Alina began, her voice steady. "This is about who gets to call this place home." The room held its breath. Frank leaned forward, a veteran of countless community battles, recognizing the strategic brilliance of her approach. Thornton's face reddened. This was not the submissive response he expected. Behind him, Diane, his wife, and the HOA's social committee chair, whispered furiously, her perfectly manicured nails tapping an agitated rhythm on her leather portfolio. A murmur of support began to spread. Mrs. Chen's hand rose. The Rodriguez family exchanged glances. Other homeowners, long silenced by fear of retribution, started to shift in their seats. Alina had transformed a personal battle into a collective moment of resistance. The HOA meeting had become something else entirely, a crucible of community identity, a challenge to systemic conformity. Thornton's gavel seemed suddenly small, almost ineffective, against the growing tide of collective voices. The real fight was just beginning. The aftermath of the HOA meeting burned like a slow-moving wildfire through Maple Grove. Alina's challenge had cracked the veneer of suburban conformity, revealing the tensions that had long simmered beneath the perfectly trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes. The next morning, Alina found her first piece of support, an envelope tucked carefully into her mailbox. Inside, a handwritten note from Mrs. Chen. "Strength is our collective voice." Accompanying the note was a traditional Chinese paper crane, its delicate folds a symbol of resilience. But support came with consequences. That afternoon, a certified letter arrived from the HOA. Thornton's letterhead seemed to vibrate with barely contained anger. The violation notices had been escalated. Alina was now facing not just a warning, but a potential fine of $1,500 and the threat of a legal hearing. Frank appeared at her fence, his weathered hands gripping a thick legal volume. "They're trying to intimidate you," he said, his voice a mix of concern and admiration. "But intimidation only works if you let it." The neighborhood began to divide. Some residents, primarily those who had lived in Maple Grove for decades, sided with Thornton. Whispers and sidelong glances became their weapons of choice. Diane Thornton's weekly bridge club became a war room of suburban gossip, each hand of cards accompanied by increasingly elaborate theories about Alina's agenda. But others began to rally. The Rodriguez family started leaving small tokens of support, a hand-drawn sign, a plate of homemade empanadas. Mrs. Chen's wind chimes seemed to sing a little louder, a musical protest against conformity. Social media became an unexpected battleground. A local community Facebook group, typically reserved for lost pet notices and garage sale announcements, erupted into a heated debate. Alina's mural became a symbol, not just of one woman's artistic expression, but of something much larger. Local media caught wind of the story. A young reporter from the suburban weekly newspaper began asking questions. Thornton, accustomed to controlling the narrative, found himself on the defensive for the first time. Alina's workplace became her sanctuary and strategic headquarters. As a graphic designer, she understood the power of visual communication. Each evening, she documented everything: photographs, correspondence, research. Frank helped her organize the growing file, his legal expertise turning her personal struggle into a potential class action blueprint. The Everways' next move came swiftly. An official hearing was scheduled, with the threat of legal action looming. Thornton believed he held all the cards. Decades of unchallenged rule had made him complacent. What he didn't realize was that Alina was no longer fighting alone. Frank discovered an obscure local ordinance about cultural expression in residential areas. Mrs. Chen began reaching out to cultural preservation groups. The Rodriguez family contacted local civil rights attorneys. The mural had become more than paint on a fence. It was a line in the sand, a declaration that community meant something more than uniformity. That diversity was not a threat, but a strength. As the sun set on Maple Grove, casting long shadows across identical rooftops, the neighborhood held its breath. The real battle was about to begin. The legal hearing room felt more like an inquisition than a community meeting. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the faces of the assembled HOA board members, their expressions a mixture of condescension and barely concealed anxiety. Alina sat between Frank and a pro bono civil rights attorney named Marcus Rodriguez, no relation to the family that had supported her, but equally committed to challenging systemic injustice. Her mural photographs were carefully mounted, each image a testament to cultural storytelling. Robert Thornton opened the proceedings with his characteristic blend of bureaucratic precision and thinly veiled contempt. "We are here to address multiple violations of community standards," he announced, his voice echoing off the institutional beige walls. But this was not the same Alina who had first received the violation notice. Months of preparation had transformed her from a defensive homeowner to a strategic opponent. Her research was comprehensive. A meticulously documented exploration of HOA regulations, local ordinances, and cultural preservation laws. Marcus began by challenging the fundamental basis of the HOA's claims. "My client's artwork is not a violation," he stated, "but a protected form of cultural expression." He presented case studies from across the country, where similar artistic displays had been defended successfully. Thornton's wife, Diane, couldn't contain herself. "This is about maintaining property values," she interjected, her designer jacket rustling with indignation. "Unique art decreases neighborhood uniformity." Frank leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of decades of civil rights experience. "Uniformity is not the same as community," he countered. "Diversity is what makes a neighborhood truly vibrant." The room tension was palpable. Behind Alina, a growing contingent of neighborhood supporters filled the chairs. Mrs. Chen, the Rodriguez family, and others who had faced similar HOA harassment sat in silent solidarity. Evidence mounted. Marcus presented documentation showing a pattern of selective enforcement. The HOA's violations disproportionately targeted families of color, immigrants, and those with cultural expressions that deviated from a narrow suburban ideal. Thornton's carefully constructed facade began to crack. His fingers, usually so confident on his precision-measured clipboard, now trembled slightly. He had never faced this level of organized resistance. The turning point came unexpectedly. A local real estate appraiser, invited as an expert witness, testified that culturally diverse neighborhoods often maintained, and even increased, property values. The myth of uniformity as a financial necessity crumbled. Alina's mural was no longer just a personal statement. It had become a symbol of resistance, a challenge to the suffocating conformity that had defined Maple Grove for decades. As the hearing continued, something fundamental was shifting. This was no longer about a single fence or a single piece of artwork. This was about who gets to define community, who has the right to call a place home. Thornton looked around the room, sensing the ground shifting beneath his feet. The Overway's power, once absolute, now seemed precarious. The battle for Maple Grove had entered its most critical phase. The days following the hearing transformed Maple Grove into a powder keg of community tension. Local media picked up the story, transforming Elena's personal battle into a broader narrative about suburban identity, cultural expression, and community power dynamics. A local news crew arrived one crisp morning, their van blocking the pristine street view that Thornton had worked so hard to maintain. Elena watched from her front porch as the reporter set up, her mural a vibrant backdrop to what was becoming a landmark story. "This isn't just about a fence," Elena told the reporter, her voice calm and measured. "This is about who gets to define community, about whether a neighborhood is a living, breathing entity or just a collection of identical boxes." The footage went viral. Social media erupted with support and criticism. Local community groups, civil rights organizations, and cultural preservation networks began to take notice. What had started as a hyperlocal dispute was becoming something much larger. Thornton's response was predictable but desperate. He launched a counter-campaign, distributing flyers that painted Elena as a troublemaker, someone who was threatening the very fabric of suburban life. But each attempt only seemed to backfire, drawing more attention to the underlying issues. Frank discovered something crucial. Deep in the HOA's historical documents, he found evidence of racially restrictive covenants, relics of a bygone era that had never been fully excised from the neighborhood's bylaws. The discovery was a bombshell, connecting the current dispute to a longer history of systemic exclusion. The local city council took notice. What had been a private HOA matter was now a public conversation about community standards, cultural expression, and institutional racism. Diane Thornton's weekly bridge club became a war room of suburban resistance. But even here, cracks were forming. Some longtime residents began to question the rigid standards they had long accepted without challenge. Mrs. Chen organized a community art walk, inviting residents to display their cultural expressions. The event became a powerful statement of solidarity. Yards that had once been identical now bloomed with diversity. Murals, sculptures, gardens that told stories of heritage and hope. The Rodriguez family's basketball hoop remained, a defiant symbol of resistance. Children from various backgrounds began to gather, playing together in a way that challenged the HOA's vision of separation. Elena continued to document everything. Her graphic design skills proved invaluable, creating visual narratives that explained the deeper issues at stake. Each presentation, each piece of communication was a strategic move in a complex chess game of community politics. Thornton's power was eroding. The HOA board meetings, once closed and controlled, now attracted unprecedented public attention. Local politicians began to ask questions. Civil rights attorneys saw an opportunity for broader change. As summer approached, Maple Grove stood at a crossroads. The mural on Elena's fence was more than just paint and color now. It was a beacon, a declaration that community is defined by connection, not conformity. The final battle was yet to come, but the landscape had already changed irrevocably. The state's Housing and Civil Rights Commission scheduled a formal investigation, transforming Elena's neighborhood dispute into a watershed moment for suburban governance. Thornton, once seemingly untouchable, now found himself under microscopic scrutiny. Depositions revealed a disturbing pattern. Years of meticulously maintained HOA records exposed a systematic approach of discouraging diversity. Coded language in past communications, seemingly innocuous on the surface, betrayed a deliberate strategy of cultural suppression. Frank's legal expertise became invaluable. He connected Elena with a network of civil rights attorneys who saw Maple Grove as more than just a local battle. It was a potential landmark case challenging systemic neighborhood discrimination. The community began to change. Yards that were once identical became canvases of cultural expression. Mrs. Chen's traditional wind chimes now hung alongside the Rodriguez family's cultural decorations. Each addition was an act of collective defiance. Local universities took notice. Sociology and urban planning departments began studying Maple Grove as a case study in community dynamics. Graduate students interviewed residents, mapping the intricate social tensions that had long simmered beneath the neighborhood's pristine surface. Thornton's support base began to crumble. Longtime residents who had blindly followed HOA regulations started questioning the underlying motivations. Some discovered their own family histories of marginalization, creating unexpected moments of self-reflection. The most surprising ally emerged from an unexpected source. A retired federal housing investigator who lived in a quiet corner of Maple Grove began providing critical documentation. His meticulously kept records revealed decades of subtle discriminatory practices that had gone unnoticed. Alina's professional skills as a graphic designer proved crucial. She created visual presentations that transformed complex legal arguments into compelling narratives. Infographics, timelines, and comparative studies laid bare the systemic issues underlying the HOA's regulations. The city council became increasingly involved. What had started as a local dispute was now a potential model for addressing institutionalized discrimination in suburban communities. Public hearings drew unprecedented attendance, with residents from across the region watching closely. Social media amplified the story. #MapleGroveMoral became a trending hashtag, symbolizing resistance against restrictive community standards. Support poured in from across the country: donations, legal support, and messages of solidarity. Diane Thornton's carefully constructed social network began to disintegrate. The bridge club that had once been her power base now whispered about her husband's potential legal vulnerabilities. Former allies distanced themselves, sensing the shifting winds of public opinion. The HOA's legal team began to fracture. Some members privately advised Thornton that continuing the fight would only expose more systemic issues. The cost of defending their position was becoming increasingly unsustainable. Alina remained focused. This was never just about her mural. It was about challenging a system that had silently oppressed communities for generations. Each hearing, each presentation, each conversation was a carefully calculated step. As autumn approached, Maple Grove stood on the precipice of transformation. The neighborhood that had once prided itself on uniformity was learning a new language of diversity, understanding, and genuine community. The final confrontation was approaching, and nothing would ever be the same again. The public hearing was scheduled in the largest community center, a testament to the magnitude of the conflict that had consumed Maple Grove. Outside, protesters and supporters created a vibrant tableau of community engagement. Handmade signs proclaimed messages of cultural pride, systemic change, and community solidarity. Alina arrived with Frank and her legal team, her mural reproduced on a massive canvas that served as both evidence and artwork. The canvas told a story beyond paint and color. It was a narrative of resilience, of cultural identity fighting against institutional erasure. State-level investigators had spent months combing through decades of HOA records. Their preliminary report was damning. What had begun as a dispute over a fence had uncovered a systematic pattern of discriminatory practices that stretched back generations. Robert Thornton looked diminished. The once imposing HOA president now seemed small, his carefully pressed suit unable to mask the growing desperation. Diane sat beside him, her perfectly maintained exterior showing the first signs of cracking. The hearing room buzzed with anticipation. Journalists filled the back rows, their cameras capturing every nuanced moment. Local politicians watched carefully, understanding that the outcome could set a precedent for suburban communities across the state. Marcus Rodriguez presented the final arguments, a masterful deconstruction of the HOA's regulatory framework. Each point revealed another layer of institutionalized discrimination: zoning restrictions that subtly prevented diverse families from moving in, architectural guidelines that erased cultural expressions, enforcement practices that disproportionately targeted minority homeowners. Mrs. Chen testified about her wind chimes, transforming a personal story into a powerful statement about cultural identity. The Rodriguez family shared their experiences of constant harassment, their teenage son's basketball hoop becoming a symbol of resilience against oppressive regulations. Frank's decades of civil rights experience came to full bear. He connected the current struggle to broader historical patterns of suburban segregation, demonstrating how seemingly neutral regulations could be weapons of cultural suppression. Alina's testimony was the turning point. She spoke not just about her mural, but about the meaning of community. Her words painted a vision of Maple Grove that was living, breathing, diverse, a place where individual expressions could coexist and thrive. The state investigator's report became the centerpiece of the hearing. Detailed documentation revealed a pattern of systematic discrimination that went far beyond simple HOA regulations. Each page was an indictment of the system Thornton had carefully maintained for decades. Social media exploded. Hashtag MapleGroveMural became more than a hashtag. It was a movement. Support poured in from across the country, with similar HOA battles gaining visibility and momentum. Thornton's legal team began to crumble. Some members privately advised him that continuing the fight would only expose more systemic issues. The financial and reputational cost was becoming unsustainable. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that this was no longer just about Elena's mural. This was about redefining community, about challenging long-held systems of control and exclusion. The final decision was approaching. Maple Grove stood at a crossroads, with the potential to become a model of inclusive community or a cautionary tale of institutional resistance. The final verdict arrived on a crisp autumn morning, transforming Maple Grove forever. State investigators had conducted the most comprehensive review of an HOA in local history, and their findings were revolutionary. Thornton and the entire existing HOA board were removed. A court-appointed oversight committee would manage the neighborhood's governance for the next 3 years, with mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all future board members. The ruling was unprecedented, a complete systemic overhaul triggered by a single mural and the community's collective resistance. Elena's mural became more than art. It was now a protected cultural landmark, with the state recognizing it as a critical piece of community heritage. The fence that had once been a point of contention now stood as a symbol of transformation. Frank watched with quiet satisfaction. Decades of civil rights work had prepared him for this moment. Change doesn't happen in grand gestures, he told Elena. It happens in moments of individual courage. The Rodriguez family celebrated by installing a community basketball court, a project funded by settlement funds from the HOA's discriminatory practices. Mrs. Chen's cultural garden became a neighborhood landmark, her wind chimes a musical reminder of resistance and resilience. Legal repercussions followed. The state launched investigations into similar HOA practices across the region. Maple Grove became a case study, a beacon of hope for communities fighting systemic discrimination. Elena's professional life transformed alongside her community activism. Design firms sought her expertise in creating inclusive community spaces. Her graphic design skills, once a private passion, became a powerful tool for social change. The neighborhood underwent a metamorphosis. Yards became canvases of cultural expression. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now shared meals, celebrated festivals, and supported one another. The rigid boundaries of conformity crumbled, replaced by genuine community. Thornton and Diane disappeared from public view, their once powerful social network completely dismantled. The bridge club that had once been their power base now served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of institutional discrimination. Local universities began using Maple Grove as a case study. Sociology, urban planning, and legal departments analyzed every aspect of the transformation. Elena found herself invited to speak at conferences, sharing the story of how a single act of artistic expression could spark systemic change. The state legislature began drafting new guidelines for HOA regulations directly inspired by the Maple Grove case. What had begun as a personal struggle had become a catalyst for broader social change. On the anniversary of the first violation notice, the community gathered. Elena's mural was now protected, a permanent testament to the power of individual courage and collective action. Children played in the new community spaces, their laughter a soundtrack of hope. Frank, looking older but more vibrant than ever, pulled Elena aside. "This is what community really means," he said, gesturing at the transformed neighborhood. "Not uniformity, but unity. Not conformity, but connection." Maple Grove was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a promise, a living, breathing testament to the possibility of true community.